Beneath the glittering domes of royal palaces, behind velvet curtains embroidered with gold, and within the guarded chambers of dynasties sworn to rule for eternity, there are shadows that history has tried to forget. Tonight, we step into one of those shadows, a tale that defies the boundaries between myth and reality, between rumor and truth. It is the story of a royal bloodline whispered to have been cursed, a curse so grotesque, so unholy, that it claimed the dynasty would devour its own children. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but in the most chilling, flesh-and-bone sense imaginable. Imagine walking through the silent corridors of a palace where every candle flicker feels like a warning. Imagine a court where heirs, once celebrated as symbols of prosperity, were instead marked as sacrifices. The dynasty in question lived not only in fear of their rivals, but also in fear of their own blood. This was not the fairy tale kingdom of jeweled crowns and loyal subjects. This was a nightmare wrapped in silk, where every heir was a threat, every cradle a coffin waiting to close, and every royal meal whispered of unspeakable appetites. We like to think of kings and queens as figures of majesty, but history often reveals something far darker. Power does not simply elevate, it consumes. And for this bloodline, the hunger for survival was said to consume everything, even the flesh of its own offspring. Chroniclers, priests, and terrified servants left scattered fragments of stories, half legend, half confession. Enemies of the dynasty painted them as monsters, cannibals cursed by the gods. Yet loyal scribes tried to cover their tracks, describing sacrifices as rituals of purity, acts meant to preserve the throne. Was this curse real? Was it propaganda? Or, perhaps most disturbingly, was it both? As you listen tonight, allow yourself to drift back to a time when the boundary between superstition and politics was razor thin. These were centuries when curses were not fairy tales, they were weapons. A single rumor could bring down a king faster than 1,000 soldiers. And so when whispers began that this royal bloodline was eating its own children, whether from ritual, paranoia, or sheer hunger for control, the people believed it. How could they not? The graves of young heirs piled up, unexplained deaths multiplied, and the dynasty itself seemed to shrink, gnawed away from within. Picture a mother, adorned in rubies, sitting on a golden throne, yet unable to cradle her child without suspicion. Picture a father, draped in royal robes, fearing the son meant to succeed him. In this cursed house, love was poisoned by prophecy. Every child represented hope for the kingdom, but also the looming fulfillment of a curse. Generations lived and died under this shadow, and the more they tried to escape it, the deeper they sank into its jaws. But let us be clear, this is not simply a tale of literal cannibalism. The word devour itself was used in layers. Sometimes it meant rituals soaked in blood, carried out to appease unseen forces. Sometimes it meant betrayal, where fathers executed sons before they could seize power. And sometimes it was whispered that the rulers themselves feasted upon their flesh, whether as part of forbidden rites or in moments of madness. It is in this ambiguity that the horror lingers. Was this bloodline cursed by the gods, or did they curse themselves by indulging the darkest desires of power? This is why the story endures. It is not only about what may have happened behind locked palace doors, but also about what it reveals of human nature. Power breeds fear. Fear breeds suspicion. And suspicion can turn even a parent's gaze into something predatory. The curse of this dynasty was not just carved into legend. It was carved into the psychology of a family that believed survival demanded sacrifice. Tonight, we unravel this chilling legacy. We will step into the myths, sift through the history, and weigh the truth against the terror. We will ask why generations of royals were haunted by this curse, why their children never seemed to survive, and why history itself has chosen to preserve them as symbols of hunger and decay. And though centuries have passed, the unease remains. When you hear their story, when you consider the weight of what was done, you may wonder, how many of the kings and queens we celebrate today were built upon bones just as cursed? Stay with me. For what begins as a whisper of legend soon descends into the cold reality of royal paranoia, betrayal, and rituals that still echo in our darkest imaginations. This is the introduction to the royal bloodline cursed to devour its own children. They say every curse begins as a whisper, And in the case of this royal bloodline, the whisper was carried on the tongues of frightened peasants, bitter rivals, and even holy men who claimed to have seen omens in the stars. Long before the dynasty's name was etched into history books, rumors clung to its legacy like shadows to a flame. The tale of the devouring curse was not born in an instant. It grew, slowly, out of fear, superstition, and the strange, undeniable pattern of children dying before they could inherit the throne. The myth begins with a prophecy, or at least, so the storytellers claim. A wandering seer, cloaked in rags and speaking in riddles, is said to have stood before the court on the very night the dynasty's founder was crowned. "Your house will rise like a flame," the seer warned, "but beware, for it will feed upon itself. Your children shall not be your legacy. They will be your feast." Most dismissed it as madness, the ramblings of a desperate man seeking attention. But over the years, as one child after another met a premature and violent end, the prophecy began to feel less like nonsense and more like divine judgment. In taverns and marketplaces, where commoners gathered, the story twisted into darker shapes. Mothers warned their children to behave, lest the cursed royals come and devour them. Priests spoke of punishment for hubris, claiming the dynasty had defied the gods and brought down this unspeakable fate. Enemies of the crown seized the tale and sharpened it into a weapon, painting their rulers not as noble guardians, but as monsters who consumed their own flesh and blood. And so, the curse became more than just a story. It became a lens through which every death, every disappearance, and every betrayal was interpreted. But here lies the unsettling truth. The myth was never confined to metaphor. While some insisted devour meant only that rulers destroyed their heirs through political murder or exile, others swore it was literal. There are chronicles, half lost in the dust of monasteries, that describe secret rites performed in locked chambers, where blood was spilled to feed unseen powers. Whether these accounts were propaganda, exaggeration, or genuine testimony remains debated, but the effect was undeniable. A dynasty's reputation was stained in whispers of cannibalism, of mothers driven mad enough to eat the flesh of the infants they had birthed, of fathers tearing down their sons with hands stained in both ink and blood. It is important to understand the climate of fear in which this myth thrived. This was an age when famine could sweep through a kingdom in a single winter, when the line between hunger and madness blurred easily. People had seen neighbors reduced to desperate acts during times of starvation. They knew the horror of survival at all costs. So when whispers came that their rulers, those meant to embody order and stability, were feeding upon their heirs, it struck a chord of recognition. They had seen desperation before. Now, they believed it ruled them from the throne. As centuries passed, the story of the curse hardened into legend. Poets wrote of it in hushed verses. Folklore transformed the royals into half-human, half-demonic figures, cursed to dine on their own lineage until no heirs remained. Some claimed the curse was a punishment for forbidden pacts. The dynasty's founder had allegedly bargained with dark forces to seize the throne, and in return, the gods demanded the flesh of his descendants. Others believed it was the manifestation of unchecked greed, that the family's hunger for land, wealth, and power became so consuming it eventually turned inward, forcing them to devour their children as they had devoured kingdoms. And yet, history complicates the myth. There were heirs who died of disease, heirs killed in war, heirs executed for treason. Each of these could be explained rationally, without invoking curses or dark magic. But the pattern, the sheer number of young royals who never reached maturity, was too striking to ignore. It was as though fate itself was erasing the dynasty's future, one child at a time. That pattern became the soil in which the myth of the devouring curse flourished. The most dangerous part of such a story is how it seeps into the minds of those it targets. The dynasty itself began to fear the curse. Paranoia spread within palace walls, feeding the myth with every decision they made. Some rulers became obsessed with purifying their bloodline, turning to dangerous rituals in hopes of breaking the prophecy. Others preemptively struck down their own heirs, convinced that betrayal was inevitable. In their desperate attempts to escape the curse, they became the very embodiment of it. And to outsiders, the evidence was damning. Every act of violence against a child seemed to prove the prophecy was real. So was the curse literal, or was it metaphor? The truth may be both simpler and more terrifying. Perhaps no supernatural hand guided their downfall. Perhaps the curse was born from human fear, from paranoia so intense it drove parents to slaughter their heirs in the name of survival. And yet, to the people watching from the outside, the difference hardly mattered. Whether the bloodline devoured its children in ritual chambers or on the battlefield of succession, the result was the same: graves filled with young royals, and a dynasty slowly collapsing in on itself. This is the power of myth. Once it takes hold, it does not need proof. It needs only repetition, passed from mouth to mouth, etched into song, whispered as warning. Over time, it becomes truth, and truth becomes legacy. The devouring curse was not only about the deaths that occurred. It was about the fear that spread like wildfire through the kingdom, the certainty that no royal child could ever be safe, the belief that every heir was already doomed. And so the stage was set. A dynasty cursed in the eyes of its people, trapped by the very stories that surrounded it. Every birth became a tragedy in waiting. Every cry of a newborn prince or princess echoed with the knowledge that they, too, might one day be consumed by fear, by betrayal, by ritual, or by the very parents who should have protected them. The myth had taken root, and what followed would blur the line between horror and history forever. To understand the curse, we must first understand the world in which it was born. The dynasty did not rise in a vacuum. It was forged in an age of famine and conquest, where kingdoms bled each other dry in endless wars, and the throne was less a seat of stability than a battlefield painted in gold. It was a time when power was inherited not only through blood but also through bloodshed, when sons could be crowned in one season and buried in the next, and when every king and queen ruled under the constant shadow of rebellion. The dynasty in question emerged from the ashes of chaos. Before its founders seized power, the land was divided among warring lords, each tearing at the carcass of a kingdom already weakened by plague. Starvation haunted the villages. Armies marched not for justice, but for survival, plundering grain stores and burning homes. In such a climate, the appearance of a new ruler was both a relief and a terror. He promised order, but the cost of that order would prove darker than anyone imagined. From the very beginning, the bloodline was obsessed with purity and permanence. They did not simply want to rule. They wanted to outlast time itself. Their family was to be eternal, their reign carved into destiny. To achieve this, marriages were arranged not for love but for political survival, often within the same bloodline. Cousins married cousins, uncles took nieces, and generation after generation tightened the web of kinship until the family tree resembled more a strangled knot than a flourishing branch. Outsiders whispered that the dynasty was poisoning itself, that the gods would never tolerate such arrogance, and that sooner or later, the blood would turn against itself. The palace they built became both a fortress and a prison. Its high walls were designed not only to keep enemies out, but also to keep secrets in. Behind its gilded gates, rulers walked with paranoia carved into their faces. Courtiers spoke only in whispers, servants bowed until their spines ached, and every corner was haunted by the knowledge that what happened inside was never meant for the outside world. Yet rumors always leaked, as they inevitably do. A missing child here, a silent funeral there, and the whispers of a curse grew louder with each generation. The social structures of the time only deepened the fear. The peasants who toiled in the fields believed deeply in curses, omens, and divine punishment. To them, every storm, every famine, every stillborn child was a sign from the heavens. So when they saw their rulers' children dying mysteriously, it confirmed their worst suspicions. They spoke of divine retribution, of gods punishing a family that had grown too proud, too hungry, too unclean. Their gossip became folklore, and folklore became history. Meanwhile, the court was riddled with rivalries. Brothers plotted against brothers, mothers shielded their sons only to see them dragged away, and advisors whispered into royal ears with poisonous intentions. It was a world where loyalty was currency, and betrayal could mean survival. Every heir was both a future king and a potential enemy, and in such a climate, affection between parent and child became tainted with suspicion. If you loved your child too much, you risked being blinded to the knife they might one day raise against you. If you distrusted them too much, you became the curse itself, cutting down your own blood before they could ever grow. The religious climate added another layer of dread. Priests spoke of balance between the heavens and earth, of blood debts that could not be ignored. Sacrifices were not uncommon in neighboring regions, and whispers suggested the dynasty had taken these rituals further than anyone dared admit. Were the deaths of their children natural, or were they offerings, attempts to appease divine forces that might otherwise destroy the throne? The people never knew for certain, but the rumors fed the legend of the devouring curse until it seemed inseparable from the dynasty's identity. What makes this history so haunting is the contrast between the image and the reality. To the outside world, the dynasty projected grandeur. Banquets overflowing with food, festivals filled with music, crowns glittering with jewels stolen from conquered lands. Yet beneath this facade of prosperity lay a dynasty cannibalizing itself. In the very halls where laughter echoed during feasts, the cries of grieving mothers lingered in secret chambers. The more the royals celebrated their power, the more the people whispered of their hunger for flesh and blood. The historical records of this dynasty are fragmented, often deliberately so. Later rulers tried to erase the more scandalous episodes, burning documents and silencing chroniclers. But fragments remain. A scribe's half-erased note about a funeral conducted in secrecy, a monk's marginalia describing the red feasts of the palace, a rival's account accusing the royal house of madness. On their own, these scraps may seem trivial. Together, they form the outline of a dynasty consumed by its own myth, whether or not the myth was true. And herein lies the cruel irony. The dynasty rose from chaos by promising stability, yet it sowed chaos within its own bloodline. It sought immortality through the purity of its lineage, yet that very obsession bred weakness, paranoia, and perhaps the curse itself. Every decision to protect the throne only tightened the noose around the dynasty's neck. And every child born into the palace was both a promise of continuation and a reminder that the prophecy lingered. One day, the bloodline would feed upon itself. This was the world of the devouring curse, a kingdom where grandeur masked decay, where parents looked upon their children with fear, and where every cradle rocked under the shadow of death. To understand what followed, you must hold this contradiction in your mind. A dynasty at the height of its power, yet already rotting from within. For the curse was not only a story told by peasants and rivals. It was an atmosphere, a presence, something that seemed to breathe within the walls of the palace itself. And as the years passed, the whispers became screams, and the myth bled into history with every heir that failed to survive. The curse did not arrive with thunder and lightning. It crept in slowly, almost unnoticed, like rot spreading beneath polished wood. At first, there were only whispers of misfortune, strange illnesses, sudden accidents, children who simply faded away before their voices could echo through the palace halls. In any other dynasty, such tragedies might have been dismissed as cruel fate, the kind of losses that came with the fragility of life in a harsh and unforgiving age. But in this bloodline, every unexplained death carried weight. Every coffin of a royal child seemed to confirm that the prophecy was waking. The first true sign, according to fragments of surviving chronicles, came in the reign of the dynasty's second ruler. His eldest son, a boy barely 10 years old, was struck down by what the royal physicians described as a wasting sickness. He grew pale, refused food, and soon withered until his body seemed to collapse in on itself. Yet the people whispered another version. Servants claimed the child had been locked away, hidden from sight, and that when his body was finally carried out, it bore marks no illness could explain. The rumors spread quickly. The boy had not died of sickness but had been sacrificed, consumed in some dark ritual meant to strengthen the throne. It was not the death itself that fanned the flames of the curse, but the secrecy surrounding it. The funeral was conducted in silence, without the usual procession of priests and nobles. No mourning bells tolled across the capital. Instead, the palace gates were shut, the streets eerily quiet, as if the dynasty itself feared the sound of grief. For the people outside those gates, the silence was confirmation enough. A child had been taken, and the curse had claimed its first heir. The pattern continued. The king's second son, groomed from birth to replace his fallen brother, did not survive adolescence. Official records claim he fell from a horse while hunting, his skull crushed on the rocks. But some said the horse had been deliberately startled, its reins cut, its saddle loosened. Others swore the boy's body was never shown, and that he, too, was taken into the depths of the palace for a fate far darker than an accident. What could have been dismissed as a tragic mishap instead became another link in the chain of the prophecy. 2 sons gone, both before they could inherit the crown. The curse was no longer a whisper. It was beginning to roar. As the dynasty spread its influence, its rivals took note. Pamphlets circulated in enemy territories, painting the royals as monsters who fed on their own blood. One chronicler described the queen herself as a black widow in silks, devouring her offspring to maintain her beauty and power. Whether true or not, the story stuck. Every noble who sought to weaken the dynasty had only to point to its dwindling heirs as proof of the curse. And with each mysterious death, the dynasty played directly into the legend, its silence and secrecy fueling suspicion more than any evidence could. By the 3rd generation, the curse had become undeniable. A young princess, barely 6 years old, vanished one winter's night. Officially, she died of a fever. Yet there was no physician's record, no burial site ever revealed. Servants whispered of midnight screams, of guards dragging a small body through torchlit corridors, of red stains on the marble floors that were scrubbed away before dawn. The people believed she had been consumed, offered up to keep the dynasty strong. Whether the sacrifice was real or invented by rumor, the effect was the same. Faith in the bloodline began to fracture. The psychological toll on the royal family was immense. Mothers clung to their children with desperation, only to watch them snatched away by forces they could neither fight nor name. Fathers grew paranoid, seeing betrayal in every young face that looked too eager, too ambitious. Every heir was a threat to the crown as much as a continuation of it. And so, one by one, the children were caught in a trap, too precious to discard, too dangerous to trust, and always shadowed by the prophecy that their lives would be devoured. It was during this time that stories of forbidden rituals began to surface. Some claimed that priests were brought into the palace under cover of night, their chants echoing in hidden chambers while incense and blood filled the air. The rites, they said, were meant to purify the bloodline, to break the curse before it consumed them all. But the rituals required offerings, and the offerings, according to rumor, were always children. A lock of hair here, a drop of blood there, perhaps at first. But over time, the whispers grew darker, that entire heirs were swallowed by the rituals, their lives extinguished in exchange for the dynasty's continued reign. Outside the palace, the people watched with growing fear. Each birth that should have been a celebration was instead a reminder of inevitable doom. Market gossip turned every royal pregnancy into a grim wager. Would this child live, or would the curse claim them too? Every sudden illness, every closed-door funeral, every unexplained disappearance only deepened the belief that the dynasty was trapped in a cycle of horror. The early signs were not just deaths. They were choices made in secrecy, choices that reeked of desperation. A prince sent away to a monastery, never to return. A daughter married off to a foreign land, only to die before bearing children. Each decision seemed designed to erase the dynasty's heirs rather than secure them. And yet, each disappearance was justified with carefully chosen words: sickness, accident, exile. But the people did not believe the words. They believed the curse. For historians, it is difficult to separate fact from legend in these early years. Records were manipulated, stories exaggerated, enemies eager to blacken the dynasty's name. And yet, the sheer number of lost heirs cannot be ignored. Too many children died too young. Too many heirs vanished without explanation. Whether by murder, ritual, or the cruel hand of chance, the outcome was the same. The dynasty was eating itself alive, one generation at a time. This was the beginning of the end. Though the dynasty still glittered with power, though its armies still marched, and its coffers overflowed with wealth, the rot had begun. In the minds of the people, their rulers were no longer noble figures chosen by destiny. They were predators, cursed by their own arrogance, trapped in a nightmare they could neither escape nor deny. And in the years that followed, the deaths would only grow stranger, the whispers louder, until the curse was no longer simply a story told in hushed tones. It became the defining truth of a dynasty doomed to devour itself. The dynasty had endured decades of whispered omens and secret funerals, but there comes a moment when whispers become screams, when shadows become flesh, when myth becomes indistinguishable from reality. That moment arrived in what history remembers as the Bloodlines' darkest era. It was no longer about a child lost to fever or a prince killed in a hunting accident. By now, every disappearance, every silent burial, every unexplained scream in the palace corridors fed into one chilling certainty. The dynasty was devouring itself. The reign of King Alaric III, known by his enemies as the Devourer, stands as the most infamous chapter of the curse. He ascended the throne after the sudden deaths of his two older brothers, both heirs lost in the span of a single year. Officially, one drowned in a lake during a night celebration, while the other succumbed to violent convulsions. But the chronicles of rival lords tell a far darker tale. One brother dragged beneath the waters by palace guards while the king watched, the other forced to drink from a chalice poisoned not with herbs, but with blood. Alaric himself never denied these rumors. Instead, he leaned into them, cultivating his image as both king and monster, a man willing to do whatever was necessary to preserve his rule. His court became infamous for its feasts. In gilded halls lit by hundreds of candles, tables bent under the weight of exotic meats and rare wines. But guests often left uneasy, whispering that some dishes were unrecognizable. Chroniclers describe banquets where platters of roasted flesh were presented without name, where servants trembled as they set down silver trays, and where guests swore the king's eyes lingered too long on the youngest members of the royal family seated at the high table. Whether the accusations of cannibalism were true or fabricated, they became inseparable from Alaric's reign. To his subjects, the feasts were not celebrations but rituals, staged to flaunt the dynasty's hunger for its own blood. It was under Alaric that the first recorded executions of royal children took place. His eldest son, a boy of 13, was accused of conspiring with the clergy to overthrow his father. The trial was swift, the evidence flimsy, and the sentence brutal. The child was executed in the palace courtyard at dawn, his body never returned to the family crypt. Whispers spread that the remains were taken to the kitchens. The king, it was said, had ordered his son's flesh served at the next feast, ensuring that the bloodline quite literally consumed itself. Whether true or not, the story traveled across the kingdom like wildfire, cementing Alaric's title as the Devourer. But the curse did not stop with him. His queen, rumored to have dabbled in occult practices, was accused of participating in blood rituals to preserve her youth. One chronicler described her as a woman who drank the life of her children drop by drop. 2 of her daughters died before reaching their 10th year, their deaths recorded only as mysterious decline. Servants whispered that their blood had been collected in silver basins, offered to shadowy figures in the dead of night. Even if these were only rumors, they reflected the perception of a court drenched in fear, where every mother's embrace was suspect, every father's gaze potentially fatal. The dynasty's paranoia only deepened as generation after generation fell victim to the curse. Princes were imprisoned in towers, locked away until they starved, their bodies found years later when new kings cleared out the dungeons. Daughters were married off to distant lords, only to arrive in foreign lands pale, weak, and close to death, as if poisoned long before they ever left home. And still the dynasty clung to power, justifying each death as a necessity, each disappearance as a sacrifice to preserve the throne. The curse had become their weapon, as much as their doom. What is most chilling is how the dynasty itself began to embrace the legend. By the 5th generation, rulers were the rumors like armor. If people feared them, then rebellion was less likely. If enemies believed them cursed, then perhaps they would hesitate to strike. A king who devoured his own children was untouchable, at least in the eyes of those who believed. But this strategy came at a terrible price. The people's fear was not respect, it was revulsion. And in time, that revulsion would fuel the very uprisings the dynasty feared most. Perhaps the most grotesque episode of all came during the reign of Queen Isolde, remembered in folklore as the Crimson Mother. Unable to bear living children, She turned to rituals meant to bind the spirits of unborn heirs to her bloodline. Chroniclers describe her chambers as filled with jars of preserved fetuses, hidden away behind silken curtains. Whether these stories were exaggerations or truths twisted by time, they reveal the extent to which the curse had taken on a life of its own. In the eyes of her people, Isolde was no grieving mother but a witch, a woman feeding upon her own unborn children in a desperate attempt to keep the dynasty alive. The irony is impossible to ignore. The dynasty sought immortality through sacrifice, through secrecy, through the destruction of its heirs. Yet each death, each disappearance, each grotesque rumor only accelerated their decline. The curse was not an outside force pressing upon them. It was a pattern of choices, born of fear and obsession, that fulfilled the prophecy step by step. By trying to preserve their power, they guaranteed their ruin. By consuming their children, they consumed their future. And so the dynasty devoured itself. Not just through whispered tales of cannibalism or hidden rituals, but through paranoia, betrayal, and the steady erosion of trust between parent and child. Each generation inherited not only the crown but also the curse, a shadow passed down as surely as blood. And with every new birth, the same question haunted the palace halls. Would this child be a savior, or would they be the next victim claimed by the hunger of their own bloodline? What remains is a dynasty remembered less for its victories and more for its monstrosities. A bloodline that, in legend and in truth, ate itself alive. The curse had ceased to be a story told in whispers. It had become history, carved into the memory of a people who looked at their rulers not with admiration, but with horror. And though centuries have passed, their legacy lingers like a stain that no time can wash away. History often remembers kings and queens by their titles, their victories, their wars. But when it comes to the curse of this dynasty, the true story belongs to the victims. The children born into golden cradles only to be lowered into graves before they could speak their first words of power. Behind every whisper of ritual, every accusation of cannibalism, there was a child with a name, a face, and a fleeting existence that ended far too soon. They were not heirs in the eyes of fate. They were offerings. One of the most haunting figures is Prince Darius, eldest son of King Alaric III, the Devourer. Darius was groomed from infancy to rule, paraded before the court in miniature armor, praised as the hope of the dynasty. He was intelligent, curious, and beloved even by those who despised his father. Yet at 13, accused of treason he could never have committed, he was dragged into the courtyard and executed. His death was swift, but his absence echoed. Chroniclers write that his mother's screams could be heard through the entire palace, a sound so piercing that servants claimed it lingered in the walls for weeks. To the outside world, Darius became the symbol of the curse, an innocent sacrificed on the altar of paranoia. Not all victims met their fate in public. Princess Alira, remembered only in fragments, lived a life of seclusion. Born sickly, she was kept hidden in a remote tower, her existence known only to a few attendants. Rumors say she never once set foot in the gardens, never heard the laughter of other children. When she died at the age of 7, no records marked her passing. Only a servant's journal that described the child's pale face pressed against the bars of her window, watching the world she would never enter. Alira's life was consumed not by ritual or execution, but by fear. She was a victim of a dynasty that believed its own children carried the seeds of its destruction. Others met their end in ways that remain cloaked in mystery. Prince Cailan, the second son of Alaric's brother, was said to have been locked in the dungeons for conspiring to seize the throne. Yet when guards opened his cell months later, they found only bones gnawed clean. Officially, the story was that he starved. But the whispers grew. Some said he was fed upon by wild dogs loosed into the cell. Others claimed his bones were carried to the royal kitchens. Whatever the truth, Cailan became another child erased, his life consumed in both body and story. Perhaps the most tragic victims were those who never had a chance to live at all. In the reign of Queen Isolde, midwives spoke of cries cut short, of infants whisked away before their mothers could hold them. Some believed the newborns were stillborn, but others insisted they were taken for rituals, tiny lives extinguished to appease forces beyond comprehension. The horror lay not only in the loss, but in the silence. No graves were marked. No prayers were said. These children became shadows, known only by rumor, existing in the collective dread of a people who believed every royal birth carried a price. And it was not only princes and princesses who suffered. Servants born within the palace walls often paid the price for being too close to power. Young attendants vanished without explanation, their names scrubbed from the records. Some were said to have been used as substitutes, their lives extinguished in place of royal heirs. Others were believed to have been silenced after witnessing the rituals firsthand. In a cursed dynasty, innocence was no shield. To be young was to be vulnerable, and to be near the bloodline was to live one step away from becoming its meal. These victims were not merely casualties of politics. They were the embodiment of the dynasty's collapse. Each death chipped away at the illusion of stability. Each disappearance left the people more certain that the curse was real. The dynasty devoured its future in the most literal sense possible. By sacrificing its children, it ensured there would be no heirs strong enough, beloved enough, or trusted enough to carry its legacy forward. What makes their stories so haunting is how little remains of them. Their names survive only in fragments of hostile chronicles, in whispered folklore, in records the dynasty itself tried to erase. They have no monuments, no epics, no voices of their own. The kings and queens who ordered their deaths are remembered, even if only with infamy. But the children, the true victims, remain ghostly silhouettes, haunting the pages of history without justice. And perhaps that is the truest horror of all. A dynasty so consumed by fear of its own bloodline that it turned its heirs into sacrifices, offerings, and meals for legend. These children should have been kings, queens, builders of kingdoms. Instead, they became shadows, reminders of a curse that was both a prophecy and a self-fulfilling doom. Even today, centuries after their bones have turned to dust, the victims of the curse remain present in the story. Every time their names are whispered, every time the myth of the devouring bloodline is retold, they return, not as rulers, but as echoes. Their short lives are the most damning evidence that power, when poisoned by paranoia and superstition, can become more destructive than any enemy at the gates. For in the end, this was the curse, not simply that the dynasty devoured its children, but that it left behind a kingdom haunted by the memory of those children, their lives stolen before they could ever be lived. If the deaths of the royal children were the body of the curse, then the rituals were its soul, the dark heartbeat that made the bloodline infamous across centuries. The dynasty's hunger was not only political or paranoid, it was ritualized, cloaked in secrecy, sanctified by ceremonies meant to transform horror into power. And whether or not these rituals ever truly took place, they lived on in the terrified imagination of the people, feeding the legend until it could no longer be separated from history. The most infamous was the so-called Feast of Crimson Vows. Chroniclers describe a candlelit banquet held once every generation, a night when the court gathered not to celebrate, but to sacrifice. Silver goblets were said to brim with blood, mingled from royal heirs and distant cousins alike. Meat roasted over great fires was whispered to be carved not from boar or stag, but from those who had been set aside as unworthy of the crown. At the height of the feast, the king or queen would stand, lift their goblet high, and declare the bloodline strengthened through sacrifice. Guests trembled, for to refuse the drink was to mark oneself as traitor. To accept it was to join the circle of silence. Another ritual, known as the Night of Silence, was believed to occur whenever a royal child died in infancy. Unlike ordinary funerals, there were no bells, no priests, no mourning processions. Instead, the child's body was taken into the palace crypts, where robed figures, some say priests of outlawed cults, others claim members of the dynasty itself, performed ceremonies meant to bind the spirit of the child to the throne. The baby's bones were said to be ground into powder and sealed within the mortar of the palace walls, ensuring the dead would forever guard the dynasty. Even today, local legends insist that on storm-ridden nights, the cries of infants can be heard echoing from those ancient stones. The dynasty also drew upon rituals older than the kingdom itself, rites whispered to be remnants of pagan practices long banished by the church. Among them was the offering of the veil, a secret midnight procession in which young girls of royal blood were veiled in crimson cloth and led into hidden chambers. There, according to rumor, their blood was spilled in patterns on the floor, forming symbols believed to summon protection or fertility. Some chronicles describe these girls re-emerging pale and silent, while others suggest they never returned at all. The veil, in folklore, became a symbol of the dynasty's cruelty, a reminder that purity itself was often the price of power. But perhaps the most grotesque was the whispered rite of consumption. It was said that when a king felt his reign slipping, when rebellion stirred in the kingdom, he would turn to the ultimate ritual, the eating of his own heir. Not in public, not a spectacle, but in secret chambers lit only by fire. The act, according to legend, bound the strength of the child's blood to the king, ensuring his reign would endure for years longer. Of course, no court record admits to such horrors. But the persistence of the tale, across regions, across centuries, suggests the people believed it. And in the dark corners of history, belief often matters more than proof. What makes these rituals even more chilling is how they intertwined with the trappings of religion. The dynasty publicly aligned itself with the dominant faith of the realm, building cathedrals, commissioning sacred art, and funding the clergy. Yet behind closed doors, they were accused of twisting sacred rites into parodies. Communion chalices filled not with wine, but with blood. Baptisms performed not with holy water, but with crimson drawn from a newborn's veins. Festivals honoring saints that conveniently aligned with nights of rumored sacrifice. This blending of the holy and the profane blurred boundaries until no one knew where devotion ended and desecration began. The psychology behind such practices reveals something deeper than simple brutality. For a dynasty obsessed with survival, rituals offered both explanation and control. If children died young, it was not random, it was sacrifice. If heirs vanished, it was not misfortune, it was ritual. By framing their tragedies as ceremonies, the rulers turned their weakness into power. They embraced the curse not as doom, but as weapon, a way to terrify subjects and enemies alike. A king who feasts upon his child's flesh does not fear rebellion. A queen who drinks the blood of her heirs is no ordinary woman. She is immortal in legend, if not in flesh. Yet the cost of these rituals was immeasurable. Fear bred silence, silence bred rumor, and rumor bred revolt. The people grew weary of living under rulers they believed trafficked in forbidden rites. Neighboring kingdoms began to see the dynasty not as noble sovereigns, but as witches, cannibals, demons in human form. What began as superstition evolved into stigma, and stigma into isolation. The rituals that were meant to preserve power ultimately corroded it, making the dynasty both feared and despised. Even centuries later, the rituals linger as folklore, shaping the culture of the lands once ruled by the cursed bloodline. Villagers refused to eat meat at certain festivals, fearful of hidden echoes of the Feast of Crimson Vows. Mothers cover their infants with charms to protect them from being bound to the walls, as in the Night of Silence. Brides refuse to wear crimson veils, fearing the offering of the veil will claim them as sacrifices. The dynasty may be long gone, but its forbidden practices remain stitched into the fabric of memory. Perhaps that is the final ritual, the way horror survives through story. Each whisper, each fireside tale told to frighten children, each shiver that runs down a spine at the mention of the cursed bloodline, all of it is a continuation of the ceremony. For rituals need not be performed with daggers and goblets. Sometimes they live forever in the retelling, binding the present to the horrors of the past. History is rarely shaped by single events. It is shaped by patterns, choices repeated, wounds reopened, curses embraced. The devouring dynasty's legacy is not confined to palace halls or whispered rituals. It spread like a poison through the veins of the kingdom itself. For while the rulers believed their sacrifices preserved their throne, the very opposite was true. Each death, each ritual, each whispered story destabilized their realm until it was no longer feared, but despised. And from that hatred, history itself changed course. The most immediate impact was rebellion. As the stories of child sacrifices and forbidden feasts grew louder, common people began to see their rulers not as protectors, but as monsters in gilded crowns. Mothers whispered that the palace was a graveyard for children. Fathers warned their sons to stay far from royal service. Priests condemned the dynasty from pulpits, declaring them wolves wearing the robes of kings. At first, these murmurs remained in the shadows, for fear of reprisal. But hunger and outrage are not easily silenced. Within a generation, villages refused to pay taxes, militias formed in secret, and banners of revolt began to rise in the countryside. Neighboring kingdoms, too, saw opportunity in the dynasty's curse. Rivals painted them not only as tyrants, but as abominations. In diplomatic courts, the dynasty was described as unfit for divine right. Marriages that might have secured alliances were rejected, suitors unwilling to tie their bloodlines to one said to devour its own heirs. Isolated, the dynasty found itself encircled not only by enemies abroad but by distrust at home. The very curse that had once made them terrifying now made them vulnerable. And yet, the dynasty did not collapse overnight. For decades, they fought rebellions with iron and fire, clinging to power through sheer brutality. But every suppression deepened the hatred. Every execution of a peasant leader confirmed the people's worst fears. Chroniclers tell of towns burned to ash, of rivers choked with the bodies of rebels, of executions staged in marketplaces to remind subjects of the dynasty's dominance. These acts of terror may have maintained the crown for a time, but they also solidified the dynasty's reputation as monsters, ensuring that when their collapse finally came, it would be absolute. Culturally, the curse reshaped the way subjects viewed kingship itself. For centuries, monarchs had been seen as chosen by the divine, figures to be revered, obeyed, and even worshipped. But under the devouring dynasty, this reverence crumbled. The crown was no longer a symbol of sacred duty, but of corruption and horror. People began to question whether any ruler deserved such power. In some regions, local assemblies rose, demanding greater autonomy. In others, rival noble families began to claim that the curse was proof of divine judgment, a sign that they, not the devourers, were the rightful rulers. Thus the curse did not simply haunt one dynasty. It cracked the very foundation of monarchy itself. The dynasty's downfall, when it came, was spectacular. Chronicles describe the final king as a man already broken by paranoia, barricaded in his palace, convinced that every servant was an assassin, every advisor a traitor. When rebels stormed the capital, the people did not defend their ruler, they opened the gates. The palace, once the most feared fortress in the kingdom, was sacked not by armies but by farmers, blacksmiths, and children wielding torches. What they found inside shocked even them. Crypts filled with unmarked bones, ritual chambers stained with dark symbols, and sealed rooms where the air was thick with the stench of rot. Whether these discoveries were real or exaggerated by generations of retelling, they became the final proof in the people's minds. The devouring dynasty was not merely corrupt. It was cursed, and it had to be erased. Their fall did not end their influence. In fact, the legend of the dynasty became more powerful after its destruction. Priests told sermons warning of rulers who fed upon their own children, using the dynasty as the ultimate example of divine punishment. Folklorists wove tales of cursed kings into the culture of villages, telling children that disobedience might summon the devourer. In art, the image of a crowned figure consuming a child became a recurring motif, a symbol of tyranny's ultimate crime. Even neighboring dynasties used the legend, branding their enemies as devourers to stoke rebellion. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the way history remembers them. Unlike other rulers whose victories are sung in ballads, the devouring dynasty is remembered for its horrors. Their military campaigns, their political maneuvers, their architectural achievements, all of it pales beside the shadow of the curse. They became eternal villains, warnings etched into the annals of history. And in that sense, the curse achieved something even greater than destruction. It ensured that the dynasty would never be forgotten. The psychological impact also cannot be overlooked. To live under rulers accused of eating their own heirs was to exist in a constant state of dread. Generations grew up believing that power itself was inherently corrupt, that kingship required blood, that survival demanded sacrifice. These beliefs outlived the dynasty, shaping how people viewed authority for centuries. Even when new rulers rose, they had to distance themselves from the specter of the devourers, swearing oaths of purity, transparency, and divine blessing. In a strange way, The dynasty's curse forced later generations to redefine kingship, to build systems that tried, however imperfectly, to prevent such horrors from repeating. Today, the ruins of the dynasty's capital stand as both warning and fascination. Tourists walk through crumbling palaces said to echo with the cries of lost children. Historians debate whether the rituals were real or metaphor, whether the curse was supernatural or self-inflicted paranoia. But for the common imagination, the distinction hardly matters. The dynasty lives on not as flesh and blood, but as story, one that warns of the danger of unchecked power, of paranoia that consumes its own, and of the way myths can shape reality until they become indistinguishable from truth. The wider impact of the dynasty can be summed up in one chilling thought. They devoured themselves, and in doing so, they devoured their kingdom. Their curse did not remain in the palace halls. It spread to every field, every church, every village that lived under their shadow. And though centuries have passed, the legend ensures that no ruler who follows can escape their example. For whenever power grows too cruel, whenever rulers cling too tightly to their crowns, the people whisper the same warning: beware the fate of the devourers. History is a graveyard of kings and queens. Some are remembered for their greatness, their victories, their vision. Others are remembered for their failures, their cruelty, their collapse. But the dynasty we have explored tonight is remembered for something darker still: a hunger that turned inward, a curse that devoured its own children, and a legacy that turned a royal bloodline into a cautionary tale. What makes their story so haunting is not just the brutality of the rumors, the feasts of flesh, the rituals of blood, the children sacrificed to fear, but the way these horrors mirror a deeper truth of power. For in every dynasty, in every throne room, there is a kind of hunger: the hunger to rule, the hunger to endure, the hunger to outlive one's enemies, one's rivals, even one's own mortality. And in this cursed bloodline, that hunger became literal, consuming the very heirs who should have secured their future. Whether the curse was real in a supernatural sense or a myth born from paranoia and political propaganda hardly matters. The result was the same. Parents feared their children. Children feared their parents. Trust within the palace disintegrated, and with it, the stability of the entire kingdom. The dynasty became a snake eating its own tail, an empire gnawing at its own foundation. And as the walls collapsed, the people looked upon their rulers not as divine, but as damned. We might be tempted to dismiss these stories as medieval exaggerations, the fevered imagination of peasants desperate to explain misfortune. And perhaps they are. Yet even myths reveal truth. The rituals may never have happened exactly as they were told, but the impact of those stories was real. They changed how people lived, how they rebelled, how they remembered. Myths are not powerless. They are history in disguise. And in the case of the devouring dynasty, the myth was powerful enough to topple a throne. There is also a psychological truth hidden in these tales. For what is more horrifying than the betrayal of blood? A king slain by an enemy on the battlefield is tragic. But a child slain by his own father? A baby taken by its own mother for ritual? That strikes at something primal, something universal. The family is meant to protect. The bloodline is meant to preserve. When those bonds are broken, when the home itself becomes the place of greatest danger, the horror transcends time. It lingers, it festers, it takes root in the imagination and never lets go. And so the dynasty lives on. Not in power, not in monuments, not in triumph, but in the whispered stories of what happens when fear consumes love, when paranoia consumes trust, when hunger consumes blood. They are remembered not for what they built, but for what they destroyed, themselves. Yet perhaps the greatest tragedy is that the victims, the children, remain nameless shadows. Their lives were short, their deaths brutal, their memory consumed by the enormity of the curse. They were the ones who paid the price for their parents' desperation. They were the ones whose cries echo still in the ruins of forgotten palaces. They were the true heirs of the curse, not because they carried it, but because they bore its weight. And here lies the lesson: as chilling now as it was then, power that feeds upon itself cannot last. Thrones built on blood will sink into it. Dynasties that devour their children are doomed to die with them. The curse of the devouring bloodline is not just their story. It is a warning carved across centuries. Even today, we see echoes of their fate. Leaders who cling to power at the expense of their people. Families torn apart by ambition. Nations that consume their future for the sake of the present. The forms may change, but the hunger remains. And perhaps that is why the legend endures, because it is not only a medieval horror, but a mirror held up to every age, including our own. So when you next walk the ruins of an ancient palace, when you next hear the wind rattle the stones of a forgotten crypt, listen closely. For some say the cries of lost children still echo there. Some say the bloodline never truly died, that its hunger seeps into the soil, into the stories, into the very air. And some say curses are never broken, they are only inherited. The dynasty devoured itself, but the fear it inspired still feeds us, centuries later. And perhaps that is the truest curse of all. The dynasty may have perished centuries ago, its palaces reduced to ruins and its heirs turned to dust, but its story has never truly died. Legends that disturb us do so for a reason. They reveal patterns we cannot escape, reflections of human nature that repeat across centuries. The devouring bloodline was not merely a medieval tragedy. It was a warning, and its echoes still ripple through our own world today. Consider the idea of a family consuming itself. It is easy to imagine kings and queens feasting in dark halls, but what about modern dynasties? Political families, business empires, even celebrity households, all have shown us the same destructive hunger. Ambition passed down like a curse, trust corroded by greed, children sacrificed on the altar of power, not with daggers and chalices, but with scandals, betrayals, and endless pressure to maintain a legacy. History may no longer speak of ritual feasts, but the headlines are filled with families torn apart by the same invisible hunger. In politics, we see leaders who cling to their thrones at any cost, devouring their nation's future to preserve their present. They may not literally consume their children, but they consume opportunities, freedoms, and lives. They strip the land bare, silence their rivals, and leave nothing for the next generation. In this way, the curse of the devouring dynasty lives on, not as superstition, but as a pattern of power. A ruler who destroys his heirs, who feeds on his people, is doomed to collapse, just as surely as the cursed kings of old. Even in celebrity culture, echoes of the curse whisper. Families raised in the glow of fame often fracture beneath its weight. Children pushed into the spotlight too soon, their identities consumed by the hunger of their parents' ambition. Scandals erupt, relationships shatter, and the same pattern emerges: power devouring innocence, legacy devouring love. We may call it drama, gossip, entertainment, but beneath it lies the same ancient truth. And in our personal lives, the curse exists there too. Whenever ambition eclipses compassion, whenever fear drives us to harm those we should protect, whenever we sacrifice tomorrow for today, we walk the same path. The devouring dynasty is extreme, grotesque, unforgettable, but it is also a mirror, magnifying what exists in smaller ways all around us. What makes the legend so powerful in the modern world is not whether it happened exactly as told, but the fact that it feels timeless. We recognize the hunger. We recognize the paranoia. We recognize the way fear can twist love into destruction. That is why the story still unsettles us, because it is not locked in the past. It is present, lurking, waiting to repeat itself in new forms. And so the ruins of the devouring dynasty stand not only as monuments of history, but as warnings to the living. They remind us that power built on fear consumes itself, that families turned against their children will not endure, that every empire, no matter how gilded, will collapse if it feeds upon its own future. These lessons are not medieval, they are universal. The question that lingers is this: have we learned? Or are we still repeating the curse in quieter, subtler, but equally devastating ways? The dynasty may be gone, but the hunger remains. And if history teaches us anything, it is that curses are rarely confined to the past. Perhaps that is why we keep retelling this story. Not just because it fascinates, not just because it horrifies, but because it warns. It forces us to confront the possibility that the curse was never supernatural at all. It was human, and what is human can always return. The bloodline devoured itself. But if we are not careful, so can we.